Hey, y'all, and welcome to the short first lecture for Chapter 2 in your textbook. So, today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the theories that inform a critical approach to organizational communication. And specifically, we're going to talk about Marxism and how the work of Karl Marx works to inform the way that we think about organizations. So what am I trying to accomplish with this whole chapter? So not just this short lecture, but all of the lectures that comprise this chapter. So again, I want you to understand the different schools of thought that influence the critical perspective that we take to Comm. I want you to understand how we look at organizations using these tools. And then, perhaps most importantly, I want you to understand how communication, organization, and power are all interconnected because ultimately critical approaches to, and particularly those informed by Marxism, are interested in power, right? Who's in charge? How do they stay in charge? And how do the mechanisms of control function? So ultimately, any critical approach, scholarly critical approach, I should say, to study really has its foundations in the work of Karl Marx. And this is Karl right over here, right? Karl lived during the 19th century, and he was a German, right? Many of you have probably heard of Karl Marx. He gets demonized a lot nowadays, particularly on television and in the press and oftentimes in politics. And of course, his thinking, he famously wrote the Communist Manifesto, which is often associated with Russia, the Soviet Union, right? But it's important to realize he wasn't Russian, he was a German. He was a German philosopher. He studied economics, and he was an historian. And he was a German who happened to spend most of his life in England. And so one of the major ideas that propelled Marx's philosophy and his understanding of the economy and history is the notion of what we call the dialectic. And so he developed what's called a dialectical understanding of history that was based in an idea that he calls historical materialism. So I'll explain to you on the next slide a little bit more about the dialectic and how this works. But the upshot of it is that Marx studied both history and the workings of the capitalist economy. And he said, in essence, that capitalism in and of itself is exploitative. That in order for capitalists to make money, they have to exploit their workers. And this was, of course, very different than the kind of agrarian or farming-based economies that supported great civilizations prior to the advent of capitalism. So it's important to recognize, again, he's not, he wasn't a Russian dictator. He wasn't Russian. He was a German who spent much of his life in England. And he was just trying to figure out how capitalism works, and more specifically, how the model of capitalism affects people's everyday lived experience, right? He's not coming to take all your stuff, right? When people talk about socialism, which they conflate with communism, they think that it's all about coming and taking away your stuff and redistributing wealth. And admittedly, that is part of it, right? But it's not quite as simple as people make it out to be. So as I indicated before, Marx used what he called a dialectical understanding of history as one of the foundations for his philosophy. And he took this from another philosopher by the name of Hegel, right? And Hegel developed the dialectic as part of his theory of history. And he looked at history as a teleological process. Now, we talked about this in one of our previous lectures. A teleological process is one that's building towards something, right? It's like an evolution going towards a final goal, right? So the idea, you could think of it in terms of perhaps training for a fight or training for an event, right? Training for a race. So you practice and practice and practice, and that's a teleological process that leads up to the final result of winning the race, right? And so Hegel said that the dialectic functions like this. There's a thesis, an idea, right, that begins the process. So here, in our little model that I'm showing you, there's the feudal system, right, where the lords are in charge. This was a system of economics and social system that existed in Europe for centuries, right? So he says this is an idea. It's a model, if you will, and then it comes into contact with its antithesis, right? The antithesis, right? In a way, it's opposite, something that's very different, and that in this case are the peasants, right? You have the people in charge, and then you have the people working. And what happens is that these two things sort of collide, right? They sort of smash into one another, the thesis and the antithesis. And what comes out is a synthesis, right? So what you have then with this synthesis is you have something that combines both the pieces of the thesis and the antithesis. It puts them both together and makes something different, right? So it's kind of like if you have peanut butter and you have chocolate, but then you dip the peanut butter in the chocolate, right? And you have something that's totally different, right? Tastier, but it's a combination of both things, and that's the synthesis. Now this process, it's important to realize, goes on and on, right? So when you form a synthesis, it also forms a new thesis, right? So what you have here is sort of a new status quo or a new idea that then encounters its antithesis and creates a new synthesis, and which at the same time is a new thesis, which eventually encounters its antithesis, right? And then we have another synthesis. And so Hegel argued that this is a teleological process that's leading to something, right? And Marx looked at this and he took it for his own, and he said, okay, well, this is how it works, right? You have these different systems of ideas, and they sort of smash together and give us something new, and then that encounters its opposite, and it smashes together with that, and it gives us something new. And this goes on until we reach a certain state, right? And for Marx, I'm oversimplifying this, but for Marx, that state would be communism, right? He figured that that's eventually where we were going. So Marx uses this dialectical understanding of history in order to sort of rationalize and support his argument for where he feels that we're going, right? Now, it's important to realize he came up with this theory right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of what we call high capitalism. So there was capitalism prior to the Industrial Revolution, but not in the same way, right? The Industrial Revolution really kicked our capitalist system into high gear. And so we refer to capitalism after the Industrial Revolution as during and after as high capitalism. Some people argue that we are today in what they call late capitalism, meaning that it's going to end relatively soon, although I wouldn't suggest that that's true. Whoops, sorry about that. So what he tried to further in a way, and what in an odd way capitalism is based on as well, is a belief in the Enlightenment and the ideal of emancipation and freedom for everyone, right, despite their economic or political status. Now, Marx's big complaint about capitalism is that it really makes a few people rich, right? It makes them very wealthy. And they earn their money by exploiting the people who work for them, right? And so he was trying to say this really isn't necessarily fair, right? And it doesn't represent the way that people used to work, right? People used to work for themselves. Now, if you were alive prior to the advent of the Industrial Revolution and high capitalism, you probably lived in a village somewhere, and maybe you made wagon wheels or something, right? And you had a workshop attached to your house where you made wagon wheels, and you worked for yourself, right? You worked for yourself. You owned your own equipment. You owned your own tools, and you worked when you wanted to work. Now with capitalism, that changes, right? Because the people who work in factories, which were the main places to work while Marx was coming up with this idea, when you go to work in a factory, you don't own your tools. You don't own the equipment. You don't own what Marx called the means of production. And so as a result, what you end up doing is you have to sell your labor power, right? You have to sell your ability to work to the people in charge who pay you for it, right? So you're not working for yourself. You're working for someone else. You don't own your own tools. You don't own the means of your production. And you have to. The only thing you have to sell is yourself and your labor, right? So Marx looks at capitalism. He says, in light of this, he says, look, capitalism is the only system where the foundation of it is not to make things, right? It's not to make goods in order to produce more goods. Instead, the goal of capitalism is just to turn money into even more money. So in this kind of system, what we see is that the use value of a product, what it's used for, becomes less important than its exchange value. Exchange value is just Marx's fancy term for what you can trade it for, what it gets you. So again, I want you to think about this. Back in the old days, right, you sat down and maybe you whittled a spoon out of wood. You made a soup spoon out of wood, right? And at the end of that process, what mattered the most was the fact that you could eat soup with it, what you could do with it. So Marx says the difference between those days and living in a capitalist society is that people don't really care about being able to use the spoon. They just want to sell the spoon to get money. Right? And then he takes it a step further, and he says that some industries in capitalism, like finance, don't even make anything or provide any services. Like they literally don't make anything. They just leverage money in an attempt to make more money. And when you think about it, someone like a banker, for instance, who particularly an investment banker, whose job is just to take money and invest it to try and make more money, he or she isn't making anything valuable, right? They aren't making any goods or products. They're not making spoons that we could use or tires that could go in our car. They're just using money, leveraging money, to make more money. And in Marx's view, right, this is kind of crazy, right? Like why? It's really abstract. It gets really far away from the idea that we used to just make stuff so that we can use it, right? And that's why we were interested in making things. Now he goes on to say that the capitalist exploits the worker, and this exploitation is kind of hidden, right? It's hidden because when you get hired to go do work for someone, right, you get paid for it, and you think, okay, well I'm getting paid for my labor, right? But what you don't see is that they're paying you $1 for your work, but you create $2 worth of value. That's how the capitalist makes money, right? I'll pay you $1 to make me something that I'll go and sell for $2, right? I'll pay you $1 an hour to make me burgers, and I'm going to sell those, each burger that you make for $2. And that extra dollar that the capitalist makes is what's called surplus value, and it's where they make a profit, right? That's how capitalism works. So again, surplus value is where the capitalist earns their profit. Now again, surplus value is hidden because you're getting paid. You don't even really think about it. Oh, well, I get paid for a full day's work, but you don't realize that you're making more value than what you're being paid for, right? You're paid, so in reality, right, Marx argues, the worker is paid for only that portion of the working day that is necessary to maintain the worker. I just pay you enough so that you can eat, have clothes, have a car to get to work, whatever you need, right? That's called necessary labor. So I just pay you for necessary labor. The rest of the day, everything that you make, right, that I earn a profit on, is surplus labor. labor, and it's actually unpaid, right? You don't get paid for the profit that I make. You see? Now, you can make it yourself in theory and sell it and get all the value, right? But you really can't, because you don't own the means of production. You don't own the factory. You can't make it because you don't have the tools. All you have to sell is your labor. So, in Marx's terms, right, what capitalists want you to do are to they want to increase efficiency, right? So that means that they want you to produce an ever-increasing amount of surplus value. So that's the value that the capitalist gets, right? And they want to get as much value out of you as they can, while the amount of wages that they pay you stays the same. And what's so crazy, to Marx at least, is that workers seem to be happy to work harder and harder while really not getting anything more for this extra work. In fact, we find that there's a long history of companies firing employees as they increase efficiency. So if you get really good, if there are 10 guys who get really good at making widgets, and they make even more widgets than I need, right? Well, then I can fire 5 of them and just keep those other 5 guys on to produce the number that I need and pay them less, right? So then, Marx's real question at the end of the day is, why do we do it? We know we're being exploited, so why do we do it, right? Why not just rise up and say enough's enough, right? So that's, ultimately he thinks that's where capitalism is going, right? Marx always said that the capitalism would end with people realizing this, uniting as workers, and just saying, screw this, we're not going to be exploited anymore. But that obviously hasn't happened. All right, so that's it for the basics on Marxism, and next time we'll talk a little bit about Marx and this thing called ideology. Thanks for checking out the video.